Hello, thank you for coming to the Center for International Studies Starr Forum on Yemen, featuring Ambassador Barbara Bodine. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping things. One being to please turn off your cellular devices or mobile devices. And also, during the Q&A, please come down to the mics in the aisles to ask your questions, as we want to capture the audio on our video. Also wanted to mention a few upcoming events. We have the MIT and Harvard Working Group on Gaza sponsoring a couple of events on Gaza following up on the crisis of January 2009, and that will be on April 15th at Harvard and April 21st at MIT. And also on May 6th, we're bringing the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Kai Bird to discuss his latest book, Crossing Mandelbaum's Gate. And the details on the Gaza events, we have flyers in the back, and if you want details on any or all of our events, you're welcome to sign up on our Starr Forum email list if you haven't already. Now, it's an extreme pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Ambassador Barbara Bodine. I have a very brief, well, a condensed version of her very long list of accomplishments. Ambassador Bodine has spent over 30 years in the U.S. Foreign Service. During that time, she spent primarily on Arabian Peninsula and greater Persian Gulf issues, specifically U.S. bilateral and regional policy, strategic security issues, counter-terrorism, and governance and reform. Her tour as ambassador to the Republic of Yemen, which was from 1997 to 2001, saw enhanced support for democratization and increased security and counter-terrorism cooperation. Ambassador Bodine also served in Baghdad as Deputy Principal Officer during the Iran-Iraq War, Kuwait as Deputy Chief of Mission during the Iraqi invasion and occupation of 1990 to 1991, and again seconded to the Department of Defense in Iraq in 2003 as the Senior State Department official and the first coalition coordinator for reconstruction in Baghdad and the central governorates. Her first assignment in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs was as country officer for the Two Yemens and security assistance coordinator for the peninsula. She later returned to that office as deputy director. In addition to several other assignments in the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, she was associate coordinator for counterterrorism operations and subsequently acting overall coordinator for counterterrorism, director of East African Affairs, dean of the School of Professional Studies at the Foreign Service Institute, and senior advisor for international security negotiations and agreements in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. She is the recipient of a number of awards, including the Secretary's Award for Valor for her work in occupied Kuwait and the Distinguished Service Award. Since leaving the government, Ambassador Bodine has been director of the Governance Initiative in the Middle East at the Kennedy School of Government and at the Center for International Studies. She was the Robert E. Wilhelm Fellow. Currently, she is lecturer in public policy at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and also serves as director of the school's Scholars in the Nation's Service Initiative. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Bodine.
We should be getting a map of Yemen up there. First of all, thank you very much for the introduction. I appreciate that. It's very nice to be back in Boston and very nice to be back at MIT in the center. We were both commenting that time had passed very quickly, and it's actually been 2 years since I've been here, so thank you very much for the invitation to return. Thanks to Rimsky-Korsakov and Walt Disney, most people have some familiarity with 1001 Arabian Nights. But one story that we often don't know is one that is actually based in Yemen. And it's the story of a king who has 3 sons who are fractious and argumentative and fighting each other all the time. As I said, this is a story about Yemen. And at a certain point, the king decides that he cannot get his 3 sons under control, who of course are arguing over who's going to run the place. And he sets them on a quest, and he says, whichever of you brings me the most valuable gift, you will have my kingdom. And the 3 boys take off in different directions. One heads down south towards Africa, one heads east towards Asia, and the other heads north towards the Arab world. And while they're gone, they each find a very valuable gift. And I will say that these three gentlemen are not the three wise men. That's another story about Yemen. And they come back, and when they come back, they discover that their father's kingdom is under siege and their father's throne is in peril. They also discover that each of their gifts individually will not do anything to save the kingdom or save their father, but put together, they will save their father and the kingdom. And so they join forces, and everything is saved, and their father is happy, and the three boys go on to run the kingdom jointly. Now, this nice little story is very Yemeni in a number of ways. It does reflect it's almost a creation myth or a creation story out of the Middle East of the Yemenis heading eastward towards Asia, south to Africa, and north into the Arab heartland. And that part is actually historically true. But it also says a little bit about Yemeni culture that I think we should bear in mind, which is they will quarrel endlessly. They are not given to mediation, but threatened from the outside, they will join forces in order to save Yemen. To borrow a phrase from a fellow Missourian, Mark Twain, the reports of Yemen's demise have been greatly exaggerated. The decisions and the commitments, however, that the international community and the Yemenis make this coming year will, and as were affirmed at the London conference, and the sustainability of those commitments are going to determine whether or not the reports of Yemen's demise are self-fulfilling. Yemen is not a failed state. It is a fragile state, and it faces challenges, economic, demographic, political, and security that would sunder most other countries. There are those who would write Yemen off as a lost cause, would dismiss it as a sinkhole of economic assistance, would outsource its solutions to its neighbors, or turn it into the third front, even though we have not yet successfully completed front one and front two. To write it off, I think, is premature. To declare it a sinkhole of economic assistance is to overstate both the quality and the consistency of the assistance that we've given to date. To outsource it to its neighbors is an abdication and would be counterproductive one at that. And to open a third front at this stage, for us, would be pure folly. The United States, along with its partners, does have the ability to help Yemen walk back from the brink of disaster, however. And I think I am having, is this thing going in and out as much as it seems to? Or is it just me? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm hearing strange echoes. It's fine? Okay, thank you. The fundamental challenges that Yemen faces are critical natural resource issues, energy and water, and an insufficient state and human capacity. Yemen's government is not unmindful of the threat that is posed by al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but that is not its sole threat and is not yet an existential threat. A security-centric approach on our part will not be sufficient or successful in addressing our immediate security needs or Yemen's medium and long-term stability challenges. Efforts at security that do not address issues of stability and legitimacy ignore the basic lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan. A partnership with Yemen to deny AQAP, which is a whole lot easier than al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP sanctuary on Yemeni soil, or the capacity to operate against other targets with impunity, that operates outside of the context of the two other major challenges facing Yemen, is also not going to work. We must remain mindful of the problems in the north and the south. The northern and southern threats are economic and state infrastructure driven more than they are driven by ideology, and certainly more than they are driven by religion. They cannot be solved militarily, and they are certainly much more than humanitarian issues, nor do they demand just a simple power sharing arrangement. Mediated efforts are best left to regional partners who do not have a direct agenda or checkered history in the country. In other words, it should not be left to Saudi Arabia. To the extent that the Yemeni people see our presence and our efforts in their country as really little more than an American third front in a fight against al-Qaeda, with Yemen as little more than a proxy battleground, and see no corresponding commitment to Yemen as a nation or the Yemeni people, then their disillusionment with us will continue to slide into anti-Americanism. Our announced economic package and development strategy is a major improvement over what we have done in the past, but it is still woefully inadequate. To be effective and credible, it needs to have the profile, the funding, and the sustained commitment of our security package. It has to work on governance, it has to work on state and human capacity at the national and at the local level. It is also not a U.S. endeavor only. This is a major undertaking, and it must be done in an international context. Many years ago, when I was ambassador to Yemen, and it is now becoming many years ago, a senior European Union diplomat came to visit, and he had dinner with those of us from the major donor countries and major donor organizations. And he asked us if we were optimistic or pessimistic about Yemen. And we, as a group, kind of ran through all of the basic problems that Yemen faces. And at the very end, he said, "Oh, well, then you must be pessimistic." And we said, no, actually, we're optimistic. And he said, "Why on earth would you be optimistic?" We said, "Because the Yemeni people have not yet given up on Yemen, that they still believe that their country can succeed and that it need not fail, and that so long as they had not given up, we really were in no position to give up." In looking at solutions to Yemen, and I will go into some of the challenges in greater detail in a minute, I think it's very important first up to explain what Yemen is not, and then I will talk about what Yemen is. Yemen is not Iraq. It does not have the sectarian differences that have exploded in Iraq and threatened to pull that country apart. There are Zaydis and Shafis, not Sunnis and Shia, and they do not have the same theological divisions that have torn apart many other countries. Yemen is not Iraq. Yemen also does not have the same tribal structure that Iraq does. It is actually less tribal than Iraq. Yemen lacks the ethnic and linguistic cleavages of Afghanistan and Iraq. One of the major strengths of Yemen is a very strong national identity. I have somebody here who is a Peace Corps volunteer, and we have 2 Peace Corps volunteers, okay. And I am kind of looking up at them, and they're kind of nodding their heads, so I'm okay. But it has an enormously strong national identity. One of the things that struck me when I was ambassador, and this is a large country, it's about the size of France, is that wherever you go in Yemen, they consider themselves Yemeni. And more importantly, they consider the other people Yemenis. You can see Yemen's history in the face of the Yemenis. If you go to the Hadramaut, you see a very strong Southeast Asian. Remember the story of the 3 boys. You go to the Hadramaut and you see a very strong Southeast Asian face. You go to Aden, you see a very strong South Asian face. You go to the Tihama, you see Africa, and you go to the north and you see the Arab world. But what was always striking to me is the Hadramis saw themselves as Yemeni. They accepted the Tihamis as Yemeni, and vice versa. So you have a national identity that you do not have in places like Afghanistan, and you certainly don't have the divisions that you have in Iraq. Yemen also does not have the same kind of clan structure that you have in Somalia, and has destroyed that country over the last 20 years. There is far more fluidity to the society than the label tribal would imply to most Americans, and a far greater tradition of effective participation and accountability. Yemen, oddly enough, or believe it or not, is politically more developed than the 3 template states of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. The U.S. Congress, current and past administrations, and major democracy support organizations all have recognized Yemen as an emerging democracy. More importantly, it is an indigenous democracy. And it is one based on Yemeni traditions of participation, accountability, and an egalitarian structure. It has its flaws, it has its problems, but it is a democracy. It has had 5 parliamentary elections, contested presidential elections, local elections, national multi-party structure, universal suffrage. This is a country that is actually politically well ahead of countries that get a lot more credit for being democracies. History matters. When I first started working on Iraq, a couple of years ago, in 2003, I was talking with a senior U.S. government official who shall remain nameless. And as I was trying to get through to him some of Iraq's history and how it would inform our policies, I was told that we are smarter than history. We're not. And while history can only take you so far, and it's not a substitute for analysis or for policy, if your policy is not informed by history, your policy will be wrong. So very, very briefly, a little bit of history. Yemen is in many ways 3 countries. The northern part, well, let me give you another example of things Yemeni. Yemen is a paradox and a conundrum. The old North and South Yemen, which some of you may recall, were actually east and west of each other. The Yemenis are nothing if not contrary. It is an ancient country. It is not a colonial construct. We all know of Yemen from our own history of the Queen of Sheba, the 3 wise men of the Nativity. There were a number of very powerful Jewish kingdoms there at one point. And it's, again, probably reflecting the nature of Yemenis. It is also supposed to be the burial place of Cain and Abel. The northern part is highlands, tribal, rugged, and very traditional. Aden Port was a prize for centuries. It sits actually roughly equidistant from Singapore to Durban, South Africa, to Gibraltar. And in fact, it was one of the jewels of the British Crown. The eastern portion, the Hadramaut, very socially conservative, and even though it was under the British colonial structure, it was actually protectorates. And because of that, it was able to operate very politically independently through most of its history. And at the time of South Yemen's independence from the British, its relationship with Aden was extraordinarily difficult. Aden was relatively modern, relatively well-educated, very much part of the British colonial structure, and stapled together with it was the eastern portion with very traditional sultanates of almost a 17th, 18th century variety. The unification in 1990 passed with almost no recognition by the outside world. We were all focused on the unification of Germany. And it was an interesting unification. It was a negotiated unification. It was contractual. But it was never a very easy one. North Yemen came into the Union with approximately 15 million people. The South brought in 2 million people. The North was a republic of sorts. They had had their own revolution where they had overthrown a very medieval theocracy. The South was this odd conglomeration of a former British colony and medieval sultanates. The size disparity, the historical disparity, and the resource disparity made the Union always a very awkward fit. But it was one that had been part of the Yemeni narrative for decades. Both the Northerners and the Southerners had wanted the country united. However, they each brought in unreal expectations about what the unity would bring. And it did not last. It was jarred and battered from the beginning, largely, again, because of disparate senses of expectations. The South, in 1994, did launch a small civil war. And when you hear news reports, and I love listening to the news, we kind of discover Yemen about once every 10 years. And when we discover it, They always talk about the Civil War between the North and the South, as if it was the American Civil War, something that lasted years. This Yemeni Civil War lasted 67 days. And it was primarily a creation of Saudi Arabia. It was an effort by the Southerners to try to reassert some political control, but it did not have the support of the broad swath of Yemeni people. Where it is similar to our civil war is that it did answer the question as to whether or not Yemen would be a unified state. And since then, there has been a national agreement that Yemen should remain a unified state. What has been the U.S. relationship with this odd country over the decades? Mostly one of benign indifference. We had no relationship whatsoever with southern Yemen. It was a Marxist state. It was the only Marxist state in the Middle East. It was run primarily by East German Stasis and Cuban medical missionaries. Northern Yemen, we had something of a relationship with it, but not really very much. Only when something bad happened did we manage to take notice of it. My first job in the Middle East Bureau was to work on Yemen. And at that point, I was the officer in charge of the Two Yemen, having never known that there were even one. And one of the very first things that happened was I lost 3 heads of state in 9 months. I can tell you as a career Foreign Service officer, it is not very good for your career if you are continually losing heads of state and heads of government. I was told if I lost one more, it would show on my record. But what had happened, and it's indicative of the history of Yemen. The first head of state I lost was a North Yemen president who was assassinated by the Saudis. The second one was assassinated 9 months later, but by the South Yemenis. The third one that I lost was actually a South Yemeni president who was assassinated as part of a coup in the South. There is this history of bloody warfare of its older history. And this is important in remembering how they are going to be looking forward in terms of succession and where they go from here. When Abdullah Saleh became president in 1979, and I actually started working on Yemen 1 year earlier than he did, which is something I would remind him every once in a while when we were talking. He came in as really kind of a consensus fill-in figure. They had just lost 2 presidents in 9 months. There wasn't any kind of a clear succession. And so this relatively young man, who was, to be honest, really nothing more than a guard at the palace, was selected as president. The general feeling at the time was that he would last about 6 months. When he took over Yemen, it was, from our point of view, no more than North Yemen. And all it really controlled was from Sana'a to Taiz to Hodeidah, a very small triangle in the north. And really, most of it only during daylight hours. In the 30 years that he has been president, Yemen has grown from this very small enclave to a country that is at least close to 3 times the size of what it was. There is a conventional wisdom out there that Abdullah Saleh is no more than the mayor of Sana'a. And this, I think, reflects a grave misunderstanding about the structure of Yemeni governance. Yemen is a very difficult country to govern. The Yemenis are very difficult people to govern. If I had to put them on an American political spectrum, I would call them all libertarians. And I suppose if you kind of wanted to see what the Tea Party state would look like, it would look a little bit like Yemen. They don't pay taxes. They don't like government regulation. They only vaguely listen to the central government. But they have a very strong sense of their identity and a very strong sense of nationalism. The way that it has operated is one of having to balance competing forces. It is politically very complex as well. The political spectrum within this libertarian mindset includes a legal Islamic party, Islah. It includes a legal socialist party, the remnants of the communists from the South. It is run primarily by a centrist, almost non-ideological government-run party, but it does have these contested elections. You will find, when I first got to Yemen, well, one of the joys of the Foreign Service is that whenever you get someplace, all sorts of people show up in the first month, and you never talk to them again. They are the influence peddlers. But I was kind of besieged by all these people who said, I have direct access to the president. I can act as your guide into the labyrinth of Yemeni politics. Most influence peddlers have far less influence to peddle than they would like you to think. But it also occurred to me that a country of 25 million, you couldn't possibly have these many people with direct access to the president. And on one level, probably not. But there is a sense, the way that it operates, is the sense that everyone does have some form of access. Wherever you are on the political spectrum, wherever you live in Yemen, there is this sense that you know somebody who knows somebody. It is underwritten by a very odd social phenomena, very unique social phenomena that you may have heard about, called the Gatchu. How many of you have heard of God? It's Q-A-T. Okay, the two. You two don't count. You've lived there. You don't count. But a Gatchu, God is this very strange little social drug that they have. It's a little bit like going to the ficus tree in your mother's house and taking the leaves and chewing on them for 5 hours. And I never could understand what the fun of that was. But what it means politically and socially is that for 5 hours every day, all the Yemenis get together in these large rooms, and they talk politics, and they talk politicians, and they talk issues. These are very open events. They're very candid events, and they act as kind of a proto-democratic system that keeps the government in contact with the rest of the country. Another element of Yemen that I think is misunderstood is the tribal structure. And I just came from a conference this morning on tribalism in Yemen, and almost all of us who spoke said, if you put it in tribal terms, you are misunderstanding the state. We think of tribes as hierarchical structures with the sheikh at the top, and if you can get to the sheikh, then you can get everyone else to follow along. I was even asked at this conference, well, if we just paid off enough of the sheikhs, would we be able to get security and stability? I said, well, for one thing is you can't buy a sheikh. Possibly rent, but never buy. But the tribes in Yemen are really far more clans. They're far more horizontal family units where you have to solicit support for what you want to do. There is not a sense of obedience that you would have in a tribal structure. The tribes are also only a portion of the society in the old northern part of the state. There are virtually no tribes left in the south. And so when we think of tribe and we think of Yemen, we tend to distort very badly what we can do. What does all of this, I forgot to sort of kind of go back and give you some of the basics on Yemen. Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the Middle East, probably one of the poorest countries in the world. What are some of the statistics on this country? About the size of France, population maybe 25 million. The most important fact on its population is that 50% of the population is under the age of 15. Now, often when we talk about developing countries, we'll talk about 50% of it's under 25 or something. This is 50% of the country's under 15. This is a sonic baby boom waiting to happen. This is a country, all of that country, there is not a single river, a single lake, any freestanding fresh water. Its oil production, it sits on the Arabian Peninsula, one of the major sources of oil and natural gas in the entire world. Yemen's oil production is equivalent to that of Bakersfield, California. Bakersfield, California doesn't produce a lot of oil. So what you have here is a large country, an extraordinarily rugged country. I couldn't find a good topographical map, but it is mountainous in the extreme. Sana'a, which is the capital, is at the bottom of a valley surrounded by beautiful mountains. It's a perfectly gorgeous little city. It is at the bottom of a valley, and it is at 7,000 feet. And the mountains around it are ridges. It isn't if you can get to one mountain, that's it. This is not Kilimanjaro sitting in the middle of no place. For those of you who have seen Afghanistan, it looks a lot like Afghanistan. surrounded by the empty quarter desert. So you have no water, no energy, a very young population, and a government structure that is not really able to provide the basic services that the people demand and that they should expect. What should we be doing in Yemen? And what should we be learning from Afghanistan and Iraq? We have learned a lot, I hope, from Iraq and Afghanistan. We have learned, I think, from Iraq that a military solution to security problems is often not productive and can actually be counterproductive. We learned the lesson in Iraq with General Petraeus and his counterinsurgency doctrine that you need to put people first. We also learned that politics matter than military, and that if you do not have basic legitimacy, you are not going to succeed. We are trying to apply those same lessons in Afghanistan with some debatable results to date. In looking at Yemen, and particularly when it came up on the radar screen again in December, the first things that we started hearing was we need to go in and clean out al-Qaeda. We need to send in the military. And a number of us who know Yemen just said, no, let's walk this one back. Let's look at what the roots of the problem are. Some of you may know that there is a southern secessionist movement. Some of you may have heard of the Houthi rebellion in the north, which is officially over. We will see. In looking at those two rebellions and those two problems, if you look at them very carefully, they're not really driven so much by politics. They're not driven by religion. As I said, they're not sectarian. They're driven by a demand for government services. Where is the government? Where are my schools? Where are my clinics? Where is my judicial system? And part of it is driven by a misperception throughout Yemen that they have heard that there is oil, and they assume that it is a Kuwait-like oil. And they figure that if I'm not getting any services, then somebody else is, and I want my piece of the pie. Many of us spend a lot of our time trying to tell them there is no pie. What should we be doing? And then al-Qaeda, which has been our focus. Al-Qaeda in Yemen is about 100 to 200 people. When I was giving this talk at Princeton a while ago, I asked somebody, they have these eating clubs there. They're very famous for anyone who knows anything about Princeton. But these eating clubs of undergraduates run about 100 or 200 people. I said, well, this is kind of the equivalent of a Princeton eating club taking over the state of New York in terms of population. And it isn't going to happen. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is small. It has a very large Saudi component to it, therefore a very large foreign component to it. And its ability to operate is more, again, of a lack of government reach rather than a deep sense of support for al-Qaeda's tactics. So, what should we be doing? Sending in the 82nd Airborne? I don't think so. Unless Cambridge has changed in the last 2 years, I doubt that many of you support that either. But then you end up with a harder question, okay, what do we do? What I would propose, what I think we should be doing, is supporting Yemen. We still have here a legitimate state and a sovereign state. We did not have that in the other two places. We have a government that functions poorly, but functions. We have a government that is legitimate despite its flaws, but it doesn't have capacity. And so rather than putting $150 million a year into counterterrorism, it's $150 million a year for, let's say, 150 al-Qaeda members, and $40 million a year into economic assistance, which will make, I'll do my math easy. Let's say there's 20 million Yemenis. Comes out to $2 a year per non-al-Qaeda Yemeni and $1 million a year per al-Qaeda member. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Where should we be putting our money? Obvious places, health, education. Education is a major issue, not surprisingly. It's a very illiterate country. But this is also a country that is trying to work on good governance, and where the major flaw is the delivery of government services. And so my very radical solution to Yemen is, rather than building up the military or the police, or solely building up the military and the police, let's build up the civil service. What an unsexy thing to do. Let's go train bureaucrats. It's not something that looks good on CNN. We can't put them in uniforms. We can't have them run around and everything. It's so telegenic when you do those other guys. Training a bureaucrat's got to be the most boring thing in the whole world. But if you think about how you judge your government, whether it's the city of Cambridge, the city of Boston, the state of Massachusetts, or the U.S. government, you judge it on how well it's delivering basic services. Is your school system any good? Do you have health care? Does the DMV operate in a way that you don't mind going once every 5 years to get your license renewed? And that's where we need to be putting, I think, the bulk of our assistance. We also need to be working through the Yemenis. And this, I hope, is a lesson we have learned from Iraq and Afghanistan. I have an Afghan student in my class, and he gave probably the best lecture on why you should work through local partners. But particularly here, this country has a very large and active civil society. It has a very large number of its own NGOs. Let's work on developing their capacity as well. Is it slower? Is it less efficient? I'm not really sure in the long run it is, but it seems so when you're doing it. Is there some leakage of funds? Probably. But given the corruption that we've had with some of our own NGOs and contractors, I don't feel terribly holy in that regard. But on the assumption, based on my own history of Yemen, our attention span for this country is very limited. And so if we try to go in and do these things ourselves, first of all, we don't do it very well. Second, when we do leave, and we will leave, they're no better off than when we went in. So let's build up their capacity. Let me give you an example about how this can work. When I was there, came to the realization that landmines are a major problem in Yemen. We think of Cambodia and Laos and Angola and a few other places as mine-infested countries. And actually, Yemen was one of the worst mine-impacted countries in the world. So came up with this great idea that we were going to do a landmine eradication program. Major victims of landmines are usually girls under the age of 10. When I finally got this thing organized, working with the Yemenis, find out if they wanted to do it. Always first thing, ask them if it's something they actually want you to do. I was besieged by American contractors who were going to come in and take out all the landmines, and that was going to be it. And you've got to do this, got to do this. And I kept saying, no, I am not going to do this. We're going to train Yemenis to do this. We have an unemployment problem. Why should I import Americans when I've got unemployed Yemenis? It's a Yemeni problem. Besides that, they're probably going to have a better idea where the landmines are. So why don't we work through them? And through a lot of arguments, finally was able to establish a Yemeni demining program. And I was explicit about it's not the American demining program. It's the Yemeni demining program. As we worked through this, and we got into train the trainer, and we developed their capacity, and we developed their structures, and we assisted them with developing the transportation and the mapping and all these other things, an education program, a public awareness program, on and on and on. When I left, there were 900 Yemeni deminers. We had only been doing the training for the trainers. 4 years later, Aden, which was a heavily mine-impacted city, was declared landmine-free. Can this approach sometimes help us in ways we don't anticipate? Yes, very much so. Going back to my deminers, one of the things that we provided them was you have to be able to get to the minefield, so we provided them with a whole range of vehicles. We were a little concerned about them using these vehicles for purposes that didn't directly relate to the demining program, so we painted them absolute cherry red and figured at least we'd be able to see where they were as they were being used. Because we were working with landmines, we also established a mass casualty arrangement with an Aden hospital and did a couple of drills with this hospital on mass casualties. Again, assuming it was going to be something like, You know, you take all the landmines, you put them in a pile, you blow them up, and you can sometimes cause damage. Well, on October 12th, 2000, we did have a mass casualty event. The USS Cole was blown up in Aden Harbor. When that happened, you could hear the explosion all over Aden Harbor. The Yemeni deminers figured out what it was long before the Americans did. Jumped into all of those cherry red vehicles that we had provided them, went down to the port, helped evacuate our wounded off of the ship, and took them to that hospital where we had been doing mass casualty exercises. And we did not lose a single wounded sailor. Now, maybe we wouldn't have lost them anyway, who knows? But the Yemenis were the ones who were the first responders. And we all know how critical that is. And they did that because, first, we had given them the tools, but second, we had the relationship with them. So these kinds of programs can have a benefit that you don't expect. My analysis going forward is what's going to happen to Yemen, I don't know. It has a kaleidoscopic political system. It has corruption. It has a succession issue facing it. It has these demographic time bombs. If we respond wisely, if we respond with a long-term commitment, if we respond by working through developing the civilian capacity and not just the military, we will, I think, be able to keep Yemen from falling on to the wrong side of the failure curve. Can I guarantee that if we do everything right and Yemen does everything right, that al-Qaeda will completely go away? No. Can I guarantee that this will become a prosperous country, the Singapore of the Middle East? I can't guarantee that. But I can guarantee that if we don't do Yemen right, if we don't take the lessons of post-conflict Iraq and Afghanistan and try to apply them pre-conflict in Yemen, then we will have another failed state. And it will cost us far more. And we might not be able to bring it back. Thank you very much. Questions or comments? Challenges? Somebody? I'll just go home.
My name is Ashur Akabi. I'm a doctoral student at Harvard.
Oh, okay.
I just recently came back from Yemen, actually.
Oh, really? You didn't raise your hand when I asked about God. You were being shy. I didn't ask if you had chewed it. I just asked if you knew what it was.
I think it's an illegal substance in the States. I don't want to.
It is. It's an illegal substance here. I didn't ask had you chewed, just if you knew.
In that case. So I wanted to make one comment, just sort of supporting what you said, and then ask a question. When leaving Sana'a International Airport, there was a particular incident, or something that I noticed that really buttressed your point about civil service importance over security. It seemed that this was right after the Christmas bombing, several weeks afterwards that I was there. And there was this one big new X-ray machine that was over there. It looked like it had just come out of the box.
Probably.
Shiny and looked good. And there was this one Yemeni worker who, chewing gum, of course, was staring at one end of the conveyor belt, watching the bag go in and then watching it go out. I said, what is this guy doing behind the X-ray machine? They had to go see what he was doing. They figured out how to turn the conveyor belt on, but had no idea how to turn the screen on. Mm-hmm. So these bags were going in and out of this X-ray machine magically and getting boarded onto the plane with nobody seeing what was inside of them. So it underscores the point that investment in security services isn't exactly the right approach. The question that I did have is, as a student traveling to Yemen, one of the biggest hurdles of doing doctoral research was funding. And the State Department, as a former ambassador, you can probably answer this best, is the travel warning list. It's probably one of the biggest complaints that students will have against the State Department is these travel warnings. What use are they to anybody? I know it's dangerous, fine. But what use is that? The only use it has is to limit the opportunities for funding for research in a country of strategic importance.
That's a very... first of all, I'm surprised the conveyor belt was even going in the right direction. Yeah, and I'm sure that was, part of the $150 million in counterterrorism funding right there. Kind of aside on that is, we go around and we love to build schools and build clinics, but we don't actually get around to, training teachers and clinicians. And actually that built an enormous amount of cynicism towards assistance. We're kind of cynical in this country about the effects of economic and security assistance. The people at the other side had their own cynicism about it because you give us a great big shiny machine, but you don't teach us how to use it. And so, there's no manual with it. So it's the cynicism's on both sides. The travel warnings, yes, I've run into this. Last year, I teach a course on the U.S., the Persian Gulf and its neighbors. That's the way I can teach about Yemen. And I was able to take my class to the Persian Gulf and Yemen for 2 weeks. This was before the stock market wiped out some of Princeton's money. And getting the permission from the school to take 15 students to Yemen with the travel warning, it basically took me doing an oath. Why do we do them? Unfortunately, we do them because if we don't and an American gets hurt, you end up with, the State Department, the U.S. government is not taking care of its citizens. Part of it is, and this is what I did when I was taking my students from Princeton, is I know how to deconstruct them because I had to write the damn things. And what we're saying and what we're not saying. Unfortunately, most universities don't know how to deconstruct them. And so, cautions against, unnecessary travel. Well, that means basically you can come. Be careful where you go in the country. They're written very, very, but they're almost Talmudic in the way that they're written. And you have to understand how to do it. Unfortunately, if we don't do them and something happens, then there is a huge outcry. And so I have watched over the years, as we now have travel warnings on almost every country. We have ones that say, be wary of being on the subways in London, because of the bombings of the London tube. We had a case where a young man went to, I believe it was Mexico, as a tourist, and he was in an auto accident and got killed, which is a tragedy. It happens. It happens everywhere. His parents tried to sue the U.S. government for not warning that driving on Mexican roads might be hazardous. And you're kind of going, where isn't it? I don't have, an answer for that. I can tell you it's a frustration that is shared by embassies and by the State Department outside of our security people who do understand the importance of having scholars come to Yemen. We have a corresponding problem. It is extremely difficult now for Yemeni scholars to come here. We have this almost a blanket prohibition on Yemenis or anyone who has been to Yemen or thought about Yemen or flown over Yemen. From you probably are going to have trouble, because you've been to a lecture on Yemen. That, we overgeneralize, we overprotect, and as a result, we make it harder and harder for us to have the kind of interchange and exchanges with scholars like you going there, who will then say, this is a very different country than I was reading about. It's a very different country on the ground than the one we read about. And the fewer people who go to visit, the fewer people who will be able to come back and say, no, there's a lot more to this country. It's far more complex. There's still some hope there. These are good people. They're not hostile, but we don't know that. And it has become a very, very vicious circle that as we become more and more cut off. When I was there a year ago with my students, and I took them over to the American Embassy. I don't know if you ever tried to go to the embassy while you were in Sana'a, but it's like breaking into a maximum security prison. And I thought I had it all cleared. And we got all the way up to the gate of this bristling thing. I could barely recognize it as where I had lived for 4 years. And we were about not to get in until one of the guards looked in the bus and said, "Oh, it's Ambassador Barbara." Whipped out a photograph that was 4 years old with him and me at my farewell and let us in. You've been carrying that photograph around for 4 years? The problem that it really caused was when we were getting our briefing by the embassy, I was struck at how cartoonish the briefing was. Because we have not only restricted people like you going in to do research, but we now so greatly restrict the movement of our diplomatic personnel and their ability to wander around the country and go to got juice, even though they're not chewing, and do all the kinds of things that allows you to understand, what is the tribal structure, what isn't the tribal structure, who are the Southerners, who aren't they, what is this unbelievably complex kaleidoscope called Yemen, and be able to put the problems in some perspective and come up with some reasonable solutions. If the embassy personnel are confined to the embassy, they end up with kind of an echo chamber to the worst stereotypes. And we end up having increasingly, I think, disconnected policies as a result. It's a major problem. I agree with you. Absolutely. I'm sorry. I have a light there. I just saw you. Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I've been increasingly frustrated by the policy regarding the relationship with tribes, and I was glad to hear you discuss that this evening. And it's not really a partisan issue. Both parties have made serious mistakes with tribal relations in the United States. And I think by analogy, if the United States really considered their policies with Native American tribes, maybe taking some of those lessons in dealing with tribal leaders might be a really good starting point. Instead of trying to reinvent everything there, to work within the tribal structures. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that would be a logical step. And I was glad to hear you say that you were involved. I think today you were in a tribal government discussion or conference. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you, is there any sort of thinking moving in that direction, or do you think that is a wise move? Should there be more of an effort to embrace the tribal structure rather than destroy it?
Well, we shouldn't try to destroy it. In fact, I think the concern that many of us have is that we actually put too much weight on the tribal structure. And more than it deserves. First of all, we tend, and I heard it this morning, and I certainly see it in the popular press, that we talk about the state and the tribes. And in Yemen, the state and the tribes are the same. And again, don't think of these as hierarchical structures. They're horizontal, familial clans. Those in the government belong to the tribes. Those in the tribes are in the government. Those in the, it is almost more like Scottish clans than it is how we traditionally think of tribes. And I did sit down with an anthropologist to try to sort this out. We invest the tribal leaders with far more power and authority than they have. And so the concern, I think, from a lot of observers is it isn't our place to destroy the tribal structure, but we shouldn't be reinventing it either. Let it operate the way it does. But you will have people, for example, Sheikh Abdullah Al-Akmar, the late paramount sheikh of the Hashid Federation, Secretary General of Islah Party, and Speaker of the Parliament, all of that on one business card. When he was the paramount sheikh of the Hashid Federation, which is the major tribal, one of the two tribal federations and the predominant one of those two, to the extent that there were people within that federation, that was probably maybe 30% of the northern population. You have a Bakil Federation. You have large numbers of people in Yemen who are not tribal. The Sayyids are not tribal. Most townspeople are not tribal. The Southerners do not have a tribal structure. Aden does not have a tribal structure. So the tribes are a part of Yemen. But even those who do have a tribal affiliation, it is a familial affiliation, sorry, slightly redundant, that doesn't determine your politics. You can have somebody in one family, even among the sons of Sheikh Abdullah Al-Akbar. He has some sons who are in the GPC, the government's party. You have some who are within Islah. You have some, they're all over the place. So I would be very careful about over-investing the tribes as opposed to this concern that we're going to destroy them. Yes?
Barbara, thanks very much for returning to MIT.
My pleasure.
The question that I have, your presentation focused on dysfunction in Yemen, but how we might be able to act constructively. You went through a series of problems and offered very, very sensible advice grounded in your knowledge of history and your local knowledge. I have to also note that the United States, we have a long tradition of ignoring history, as you noted, and ignoring local knowledge. Looking over your own experience, after the USS Cole was attacked, large numbers of U.S. folks arrived with no knowledge of local customs or language, put footprints all over Yemen. If we turn to your experiences in Iraq, the CPA was not known for the brilliance of its actions, the wisdom of its strategy, or even basics in terms of administration. Or we continue with Iraq to the siege of Fallujah, and what set off that conflict, with actions that were, in a sense, understandable, but had the effect of inflaming a volatile situation. So the question is this. You've offered very sensible advice to us on Yemen. In the past, you offered very sensible advice after the USS Cole, to CPA, and with reference to Fallujah. You were rewarded with, let's call it, a less than receptive response, accusations of going native or being soft on terrorism. So the question here, given the dysfunctionality not of Yemen, but of us, what do you recommend or what would you suggest in terms of improving the prospects for your advice being accepted?
Well, okay, first of all, I wasn't around for Fallujah, so I can take neither credit nor blame for that. And despite some criticisms of my performance in general, I think I know that I am still listened to by at least the people that I would like to have listening to me. More importantly, I've spent a lot of time trying to train and educate kind of a next generation. The first thing you have to figure out is also when it's time to step aside. We do not always listen, not to me, but to people who know about these places. And I think, one of the lessons of Iraq was that CPA was so isolated from both people who knew about Iraq and people who knew about post-conflict. And I remember when I was here, I got to chair a wonderful colloquy between Rajiv Chandrasekaran and his book Imperial Life in the Emerald City, and George Packer and his great book on Assassin's Gate. And I got to have this conversation with both of them in front of an audience, and I still remember it. We have learned some of those lessons. I'm not sure we have come up with exactly how to correct them, and some of this goes to this problem that we are overprotecting our diplomats and we're not letting them get out and learn places the way that I had the opportunity to do. But there is a real recognition that we need to lean far more on our diplomacy and our development, and these are the people who often know countries better. There is an enormous amount of debate going on in Washington right now on how do we restructure ourselves, not just post-conflict, but as I mentioned with Yemen, pre-conflict. How do we bring all of the resources of the U.S. government to bear, and how do we develop the resources in the government so that we can do it? And so I personally spend a lot of time with the USAID people working on Yemen. I spend time with the people in the counter-terrorism. I spend time with the military. And I suppose, to answer your more narrow question, I have a lot of people asking me a lot of questions. Now, whether they will take all of my advice, that never happens. But I do think there is a recognition of a need to be smarter, and I think a need to be more humble. And again, this goes to a lesson of Iraq and Afghanistan, that we should not be creating the solutions. Even going back to my Landmine program, which I wanted to have very much as a Yemeni program, I would have some of the military guys who were the trainers and doing a superb job, but every once in a while they would get frustrated and say, well, we're falling behind our timeline. No, we're falling behind your timeline. We're still on the Yemeni timeline. And their timeline is going to be a little different than ours. One of the roles of embassies, and they don't always get a great deal of thanks for this, but we know this going in, is that when you do have a situation, let's say after the Cole, when large numbers of Americans came in who had no background in where they were, our job is to convey the inconvenient truth, the inconvenient analysis, to pull people back from doing what looks like the optimum on paper in Washington and putting some local reality on it. Do we get charged with clientitis? Do we get charged with all sorts of stuff? Yes, we do. And that's part of the job. Because at the end of the day, and this would be a conversation, hopefully a conversation, every once in a while an argument with any number of people is, I'm not going to tell you what the final policy is. Policy comes from Washington. But my job is to tell you how to get there. And my job is to counsel you from doing something that will either be not productive or even worse, counterproductive. I can give you that advice up to a certain point. In some cases, as ambassador, you can actually tell people what to do, but you still have to answer to Washington. But that is our job. It is one that is quite often misunderstood because you are putting the local context on a problem and an issue. And there will be those who will say, but American policy is. Yes, but I'm doing American policy in. And we've got to get the in part right. That's part of, what diplomats do, and we're not always as recognized as we think we ought to be, but that's just part of the job. Way in the back, but if you're going to come up, and then why don't you come up to this microphone and why don't you come to this one, because I do want to set you guys at the microphones.
Curiosity question. I'm looking back over a period of 30 years. Having been in Yemen 30 years ago, I was just curious. I want to say the December bombing attempt has given more news coverage in the last 4 months than I've seen in the last 25 years. Yeah. Which is kind of a strange situation. But one of the things that has come out in various news programs I've listened to or watched, I'd like to hear your perspective, is the resources, especially water, are really at a critical stage. And one program I listened to mentioned that within 10, maybe possibly 15 years, the capital of Sana'a will be the world's first capital that will have no water. And it could create one of the world's largest population migrations in the world, if not only on the Arabian Peninsula. Is USAID or any of the UN agencies trying to address some of these time bombs?
Yeah, the water issue is a critical issue. They are running out of water. They've been on the cusp of running out of water for decades, and I've been listening to Sana'a's going to run out of water imminently for a very long time, but I think we're actually getting closer to that reality. They have, dug wells into their aquifers that were normally replenished by monsoons. The monsoons have not been as frequent as they used to be. They're actually now drilling down into fossil water. And as we know with fossil fuel, that's a limited and non-replenishable source. I was talking to somebody the other day who is doing a study on this at Oxford, and they've actually done some you guys are at MIT, you'll understand this better than me, but geosensing of water, and it's more critical than people understood. The Yemenis are aware of it. The Minister of Water is an extraordinarily bright young man who was the head of an NGO working on this. He's a technocrat. The Minister of Planning is aware of it. The problems are almost insurmountable. There are things that people are proposing to try to mitigate. Better, for example, better irrigation. The Yemenis use flood irrigation, which is an enormously inefficient irrigation process. It works if you happen to be in the Nile Delta and the Nile is going to flood on a regular basis and you can use that water. It doesn't work if you're using fossil water. Irrigation methods, these kinds of things to kind of slow that. But nobody has a real solution. And Yemen may not be a political failed state. It may not be an economic failed state. Those are two things that we can work on to hopefully keep from happening. It does run the risk of being the first environmental failed state. Because if Sana'a runs out of water and the surrounding areas run out of water, it will be catastrophic. One problem with water issues, it's a little bit like overfishing, is that because people can't see it being depleted, as long as the water is coming, you're fine until it stops. Other things, deforestation, you can calculate that. You can't tell with water. People are working on it. Nobody has a real solution. You can do something about the population growth rate. You can do something about education and health. There are even alternatives on energy. No one has come up with an alternative on water. One basically Swiftian proposal that I heard was to, since the bulk of the population live, if you can kind of do Sana'a and around there, that's where most people live, is that since desalination is not too expensive where it is actually done, but getting the water to the highlands where most of the people live would make it economically prohibitive, is someone said, well, if we cannot get the water to the people, why don't we just move all the people to the water? The idea of doing a population transfer of 20 to 25 million people with an inadequate infrastructure and not enough money, the social and political catastrophe that would cause. It has an interesting parallel in history, however. Yemen was the site of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Marib Dam, which is way out in the desert. And it was kind of the first imperial valley of California. It was a huge dam, particularly by those standards. And it was used to create a breadbasket. Yemen was a food exporter. And the story has it that the dam finally collapsed due to a lack of maintenance because some mice burrowed through the bottom and it finally burst. Where the parallel is very interesting is obviously they ran out of water, is that it created a diaspora that goes back to something of that story from 1001 Nights I told you, that set off a huge migration of tribes out of Yemen. The Omanis come from that diaspora. The Emiratis come from that diaspora. They ended up in the Hadramaut and then heading off into Southeast Asia and into Africa. The Mauritanians claim Yemeni roots. It did set off a huge population migration. And it's very much one of the creation myths of the Arab world. But that was a much smaller population in a very different time. The idea of 25 million people suddenly having to migrate because the water finally ran out, and the subsistence agriculture and the subsistence level of living would no longer be sustainable, could be a catastrophe. And so the problem almost is not, I was part of a group that, task force last year, and we get together about once every 6 weeks and talk about Yemen for about 3 hours, which anyone who works on Yemen can do very easily. And after talking through the security challenges, the demographic challenges, all these kind of challenges, and was Yemen a failed state or not? And finally, somebody said, how would we tell if it failed? Because it's so barely surviving as it is. And the conclusion from, and these were people who've watched and studied Yemen for a long time, was that not so much that it would explode as it would implode. That this population, which is very rural in any event, 70% of Yemenis live in villages of less than 500. Most of them are not terribly connected to the government anyway. That it would just kind of fold in, and people would slowly disperse. As water ran out in particular areas, people would slowly start to leave those areas. The question would be how many of them, how far would they ultimately go? But it would be a slow implosion of a state as opposed to a violent explosion. Nobody has an answer. Everyone is looking. If anyone here at MIT can come up with a solution to the water problem of Yemen, that is what's really going to save this place. Yes, sir.
Yes. So by what means can the processes of regional integration in the Arabian Peninsula be
good question.
facilitated such that, given the current development in the Gulf in the GCC states, how can that be channeled to help the development of Yemen and some of the more lagging economies in the region?
That's an excellent question. The Gulf states, for different reasons and different degrees, are very much aware of the problem of a failed Yemen. Some of it are these historic links. The Emiratis see themselves as sons of Yemen. And so, to a certain extent, there's an emotional connection. There's a geopolitical one. If Yemen fails and it becomes a place where al-Qaeda and others can hang out, this is not going to be good. The Emiratis and the Saudis are providing massive amounts of economic assistance. We're giving $40 million a year, which is less than NBC gave to Conan O'Brien to go away. And the Emiratis are giving $650 million. The Saudis are maybe giving $1 billion. Yeah, the Emiratis is a little bit more project focused. The Saudis have a tendency to write checks to people, and I think it fuels some of the corruption. One problem with integration into the region, Yemen has been talking with the GCC for a very long time about joining the GCC. I personally don't think it's going to happen. For the GCC, they're primarily, ruling families of very rich states, and this is a Republican government in a very poor state. They don't really have anything in common. The real problem with Yemeni integration is they don't really have anything to offer the Gulf states in return. In the 70s and 80s, Yemeni migrant workers were very much found throughout the peninsula, particularly in Saudi Arabia. The great stories about millions of Yemenis being sent home in 1990 when the Yemenis voted the wrong way on Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, are a little overblown. The workers in the 70s and 80s had been primarily construction, very low-level construction workers. By the end of the 80s, much of that major infrastructure had been built, and the workers were already starting to go home. Saudi Arabia would not send 1 million workers home if it had been an economic problem for Saudi Arabia. It was something that they could actually fairly easily do. The problem is now that the Gulf economies are very 21st century. Their tourism, their high tech, their knowledge, all of these things. Yemen is largely uneducated. And so the Yemenis don't have the skill sets that work well with what the Gulf states now need. So you have to kind of walk it back. If you're going to economically integrate Yemen, you have to educate this population. You have to take this massive 25 million people, half of them under 15, and take them from being Yemen's major liability and turn them into an asset, turn them into a renewable energy source, a renewable product, which are talented Yemeni workers. Perhaps not high professional, but at least able to work in these economies.
So that's a great potential for demographic dividend, isn't it?
Yes. It has a demographic dividend. You know, the correlation between educating a girl and having her birth rate drop. Yemenis operate, they have, by the way, a fertility rate of 6.7 to 7.2. Every woman in every audience, every time I give that, they all go, ugh. Education has a direct correlation on dropping fertility rates. It would bring money in and allow the Yemeni economy to get going. It is the major thing that has to be done. The first thing that has to be done is education. Even you got to train the civil service. You still have to have a marginally functioning primary and secondary school system. If you were to put the money into the education system, you would also be employing Yemenis. In order to staff all those schools, you have to train Yemenis, so you're getting at the unemployment problem. So you have to do all of this. It has to be a comprehensive program that looks at why can't the Yemenis be the kind of migrant workers they used to be, because their skill sets don't work anymore. So what do? You have to fix their skill sets. So all of this is a very long-term program. The only other asset that Yemen has to integrate it into the world economy is Aden Port. Aden Port used to be one of the 10 most important ports in the world before 1967. It is now so far down on the list that it doesn't even register. It is one of the great natural harbors in the world, and I mentioned its location is equidistant from everything, and it sits astride the Red Sea. I mean, if you're going in and out of the Suez Canal, you have to go past Aden. It could be another Singapore. It could be another Hong Kong. It could, again, be a major port. And that would, again, drive some economic development. Yes, ma'am.
Also, tourism would be fabulous. Architecture.
The tourism is fabulous, but it's kind of an adventure tourism.
Exactly.
I mean,
Eco-tourism.
it's an eco-adventure tourism kind of a place. Yeah. It's not a American Express buses, ladies and gentlemen, on your right you will see the Temple of the Queen of Sheba kind of a place.
And just one question, having been Peace Corps there, I just admire Greg Mortenson's work in Afghanistan building schools. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned we should probably look for Yemeni NGOs to support. Mm-hmm. Is there a list that we could, as returned Peace Corps volunteers, sort of get behind some local nonprofits and contribute to them, or what can we do?
That's, yes, you can, and there's a group called, it's the Women's National Union, I think it's called. And if you can give me your email, I'll get the email for the woman who heads it. What's interesting about the Women's Union is that it's an umbrella organization of NGOs run by Yemeni women, most of them working on women and children's issues. And it's a great way to plug in. We worked with that group, giving even like a $25,000 grant to a very small NGO that was working with street children. So there are things that you can do, and I can try to get that for you.
Thank you.
The tourism, yes, on one level, this place would be a great tourism place. It does have the Temple of the Queen of Sheba. It's got some of the most beautiful architecture in the world. If you've ever seen any photographs of it, they look like gingerbread houses. These 8-story buildings made out of stone with white lime around the windows, and it looks like an entire city made up of gingerbread. And it's beautiful, and for 4 years I never got tired of looking at it. Along the Gulf of Aden, it's got some of the most drop-dead gorgeous beaches you have ever seen in your life. But it has no infrastructure, and it has no population that is able to staff the hotels. That takes a certain level of education as well. We talked about, bringing, a resort on these beaches. But if you were going to build a resort, you'd have to build a road. You'd have to build a sewage treatment. You'd have to find the water. You'd have to do the electricity. You'd have to. And so you always have to take these solutions and then walk them back and sort of say, but what else do you need to support the tourism? This isn't like Tunisia, which lives on tourism. It's a very small country. And they kind of were able to turn all of their beaches into a Club Med. I would personally not wish that on Yemen as well. I kind of like environmental ecotourism. But even that kind of tourism takes a certain level of infrastructure. And even that takes a certain level of education. And to go back to my favorite little hobby horse, that takes a certain level of functioning government, that if you're going to be setting something like this up, that you can operate it, that you can get the permits, that everything works. And so it's charming in the fact that it doesn't have a lot of the bureaucracy that you find in Cairo or some other places. But a state that really does not function as a state can't bring in the foreign investment that it needs to really be able to move up from just people who like to go camp out in the desert. Another one of the things they have, they've got some of the greatest fish stock in the whole world. If you go way out to the east, I went out to Mahra, which is one of the poorest governorates in an otherwise extraordinarily poor country. And for lunch, they brought out platters of lobster. You know, I mean, at New York prices, I don't know how much lobster was sitting on this table, but it was unbelievable. And they had just basically gone out and, you know, here's the lobster. There were no roads from Mahra into the country, into the rest of the country. And there was only one flight a week. You can't do it if you don't have that basic infrastructure. So here was all of this wonderful food stock, fish stock. They had no way of getting it to market. And so even some of the fruits and vegetables, somebody once told me how many mangoes or papayas or something they produce. It's a staggering amount. And we were selling a lot of them to our naval ships. But because they don't have a basic governmental structure, they had no way of doing quality control. So even when they would get a contract to provide mangoes to German supermarkets, or grapes, another thing they do fabulous grapes, there was no quality control. So you're the supermarket in Germany, you get one batch and they're great. You get the next batch, they're rotten. You get a third batch, they're green. And so unless you have, we don't really think about, because ours actually functions pretty well, all of those basic elements of quality control, of basic regulations on health that allows you to export basic fruits and vegetables, allows you to export fish. That's the kind of basic governmental structure that they need work developing. Yes, ma'am. To the mics, sorry.
That's all right. I was once a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkey, so I'm very sympathetic with the whole idea of working with people and working from the ground up. And as you say, this terrible population problem, I mean, half the population under 15 is really incredible. And as you say, the solution, or the best thing, is to educate women.
Yeah.
So what are the barriers? I mean, are there more barriers to educating women than educating everybody? I mean, are there particular barriers to educating women? Because that will be the fastest.
About 50% of the male population over 15 is illiterate, and about 70% of the women over 15 are illiterate. So it's a problem for both men and women. The education system is inadequate for both. There was among the Western donors while I was there, and there still is when I read some of the aid strategies, the build a girls' school. Everyone wants to build a girls' school. You know, this is the warm, fuzzy thing, is build a girls' school. Everyone has built girls' schools, and it's not doing that much for the education of the girls. First of all, you have to have teachers. And, you know, duh. But what we discovered when we actually started listening and talking to some of the villages that we wanted to help is there is not a cultural barrier to educating girls. It is not a religious or a cultural or a tradition thing that, I don't have to educate the girls. If the school was there, they would go. I was working with the Social Fund for Development, which is this fabulous parastatal in Yemen. It's one of the most sophisticated in the world, that did village-generated projects. And this is how we spent most of our development money, was through them. And there was one village that they had gone to where we were going to build a school, girls' school. And we actually went to the village to kind of say, we haven't seen the proposal from you. First thing you do, first of all, talk to the women in the village, not the men, with all due respect. And the women said, well, actually what we want you to do is dig a well. I said, oh, you don't understand. We want to build you a girls' school. And they said, no, you don't understand. Right now, the young girls are the ones who have to fetch the water, and they have to walk miles. It takes them basically all day to go get the water and get back. If you build us a school and you don't build us a well, they still have to go get the water. They won't be able to go to school. If you will build us the well first and then build us a school, they can go to school. Uh-oh. Oh, okay. You know, other thing that we discovered in some places where there were schools, and again, the girls' attendance was lower than it ought to have been, they said, just build a bathroom. Just a separate bathroom for the girls. Don't build us a whole separate school. Just build us a bathroom. Oh, okay. I mean, a lot of these things that you learn from the villagers when you talk to them is kind of, uh-oh. The Ministry of Education also abolished the requirement for uniforms for girls. And the enrollment soared. They all wear abayas and hijabs anyway, so why did we have to put, what's a uniform? So there were little things that could be done that we found were really enhancing the education prospects for the girls.
Just make a comment about Turkey in general. I don't know where it came from a long time ago, but they put schools all over the country, in all the village. I mean, it's been a big movement, and they don't have boys and girls schools, they have schools.
Yeah.
And, you know, I look at the data from Pakistan, and Pakistan has terrible educational, terrible literacy, and they obviously haven't spent much money educating their population. So it's not girls' schools. Everybody needs schools. Yeah. In whatever conditions.
And and one of the problems that they have is, again, with this very rugged terrain and these small scattered villages, is trying to place the schools someplace where you can get enough students to be able to come. If this was, a nice, flat, open country, it's a little easier to, walking 5 miles to school is one thing if you're walking this way. It's another thing if you're walking this way. And then there are all the other, all the other demands on the children and the family. But this is why you almost have to have more smaller schools. It's almost going back to like the little one-room schoolhouses that we had in this country. But you have to then go find the teachers. And one of the solutions that I proposed was, it's very good to, and I firmly and actively support, bringing people back here for degrees in all those, the right sciences and right disciplines, to be the Ministry of Education people, because you have to have curriculum, you have to have all of that. But that low-level, the elementary school teacher, that can be a village girl, and she can go to Jordan to learn how to be a teacher. She's not going to have the English to come back here. She doesn't have to come back here. She needs to go to Jordan or to Egypt or to someplace and learn the basics of being a basic elementary school teacher. And some of this is also, it's not dumbing it down, but it's recognizing what are the basics that they need rather than trying to do, the big fancy version. Let's do the very simple version. But cultural impediments to girls going to school, no. Yes, ma'am.
I probably shouldn't introduce politics into this because...
Oh, no, well, all of this is political. Everything is political.
I'm just wondering if there's, as has been stated today, the U.S. doesn't do very well with knowing history or the language of a country or any of this contextual stuff that we need. But is the Obama administration doing better at this? Is there a difference in the State Department?
Well, I think we actually do better. I mean, I hope. Iraq was a tragic anomaly. You know, we normally do not go into countries that aggressively ignorant and then think that we can make it work. There was a lot of ideology and politics in that. We do have within the U.S. government, within the State Department, USAID, you know, to the extent that it still exists, and other places drawing on people in the academic world, drawing on NGOs. I think we actually have a great deal of understanding of these countries. And we have a great understanding about their politics. And I've been, this conference I was at this morning, there were a lot of people around the table who were saying many of the same things. And what was, I think, important was that the conference was organized by the State Department with a couple of senior people there, and we were there to try to get this stuff to them. They were asking the question. So they know to ask the question, they know to organize the conference. You know, one of them came up and said, you know, I'd like to meet with you some more. We do develop, you know, there are other people. I'm not the only one who knows about Yemen in the Foreign Service. We do learn the language. In my embassy, when I was there, every single one of my officers was language qualified. Every single one of them. We could all operate in Arabic. And we are working on that. One problem that we have as a holdover from the previous administration is that the State Department, USAID, and all the civilian agencies were really starved for resources and did not have the personnel to put into a lot of places and a lot of training that we would have liked to have done. And, you know, if there's only one political officer in Yemen, you know, regardless of how good she is, there's a limit as to what she can do. What I will say that I believe the Obama administration is trying to do, a couple of things. First of all, they've changed the rhetoric that, you know, it is now diplomacy and development, not just defense. It is stability and legitimacy, not just security. And it's not just rhetoric. It is a change in approach. We are not doing security first. We're not leading with the military. We're, you know, despite some calls for a third front, that's not what we're doing in Yemen. They're putting money into the civilian agencies again. The State Department is now hiring 1,500 new officers a year. You know, that's up from 200. USAID has got authority to start hiring again. We now have enough people we can put them into language training. So we're starting to rebuild. And more importantly, we have the mission and the mandate behind us to do it. Now, rebuilding is going to take some time. But when you have that change in mission and mandate, we can start to rebuild it. The most important thing is that you have people in the administration who are now listening, who are now asking the question. We have an administration that does not think it's smarter than history and is trying to correct some of these things. It will take some time. There's major restructuring debates going on. There's something called the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, which is a parallel to the Quadrennial Defense Review that's been going on for years. And that's basically trying to sit down and look at what are our needs, what are our priorities, what resources do we need, what mandates do we need so that we can move forward and the civilian side can actually do what it's supposed to do. And it's bigger than Yemen. There's a recognition that the threats that we as a country face going forward are not going to be coming from major military forces. They're going to be coming from weak states around the world. They're going to be coming from the fragile states, and that we need a different kind of governmental structure to respond. You're not going to solve Yemen with, you know, the missile defense shield. You're not going to solve it with major military equipment. This isn't where you need the F-35. It's going to be done with very basic people running around the ground trying to figure out what's going on. So I think there's been a change in mindset, a change in philosophy, and most importantly, they're starting to put resources behind it. And there is a sense that Yemen may be the place where maybe we can start applying some of the lessons and see if we can do this one right as a way of maybe atoning for some of the things we've done wrong. Okay, I know we've run over, and I want to thank you all very much for your interest and your attention. And good evening. Thank you.